I never thought my life could change in the way it did that night. The routine, the work, the monotony of the days, everything seemed normal, controlled, safe. But all of that was left behind, reduced to ashes, when I faced something I can't explain, something that continues to haunt me every day, and especially every night. I'm no longer the man I once was, nor will I ever be again. My name is John, but that's not important. What matters here is the story I'm about to tell, the story that, until now, I've refused to share with anyone. It's not a horror story to entertain, nor an unfounded warning. It's my truth, the truth that was revealed to me on that fateful night on the road that crosses the Cruz Verde Pass. And if you're willing to listen, maybe you'll understand why I fear the dark so much, the empty roads, and her. That night, everything seemed normal. There was no sign of what was about to happen. I had spent the day working on a project far from the city, and exhaustion was already taking over by the time I finally decided to head home. It was late, too late, and my mind was focused solely on getting there, collapsing in bed, and letting sleep take me. The Cruz Verde Pass wasn't my usual route, but that night, in my desperation to get home faster, I decided to take the shortcut. I knew it was dangerous, that the sharp turns and mountainous terrain made that road treacherous, but the desire to shorten the trip clouded my judgment. The road was deserted. There were no other cars, no lights on the horizon. Just my vehicle slicing through the darkness like a knife, the headlights illuminating a small portion of the road while everything else was shrouded in shadows. The loneliness was overwhelming. The only sound was the monotonous hum of the car's engine in the cold mountain air. The wind rustled the leaves on the trees, creating a distant, almost imperceptible whisper. But altogether it felt oppressive, as if nature itself had lost its life, watching me, stalking me from the darkness. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock. Almost midnight. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to stay focused despite the fatigue weighing on me. But then something changed. Something unsettling, almost imperceptible at first, but soon impossible to ignore. I saw her. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. It was just a silhouette, a white figure on the side of the road, standing by the asphalt, motionless. My initial thoughts were confused. Maybe someone had broken down, or perhaps it was a local who needed help reaching their destination. But as I got closer, the figure became clearer, more defined. It was a woman dressed entirely in white, with some sort of veil or cloak draped over her, fluttering slightly in the night breeze. She stood perfectly still, her arm extended toward the road, hitchhiking. A chill ran down my spine. Something about that image, the way she stood so still, so strange in the middle of that deserted road, deeply unsettled me. My heart started to race, and a part of me, a deep, visceral part, told me not to stop, to keep driving, not to pay attention to her. But I didn't. I braked. I slowly rolled down the car window and, in the silence of the night, asked if she needed help. The woman didn't respond immediately. For a few moments, which felt like an eternity, she just stared at me. Her face was partially hidden in the shadow of her hood, but I could see enough. Her skin was extremely pale, almost translucent under the headlights. Her eyes, they were dark, too dark, as if there were no life in them. I felt her gaze piercing me in an odd way, as if she were looking through me, or beyond me. Finally, she nodded. She didn't say a word. She didn't utter a single sound, but she opened the back door of the car and sat in the back seat with an eerie softness, as if she floated rather than moved like any normal person. She closed the door with a soft click, and suddenly, the car felt heavier. Not physically, but in the atmosphere. It was as if something invisible, something dark, had slipped inside with her. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, and the air became thick, oppressive. A smell of dampness, of wet earth, began to fill my senses, and I immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. I started driving again, though every fiber of my being told me that the best thing would have been to stop and run. But I didn't. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the fear of looking like a coward, or maybe it was that strange fascination with the unknown, with what we simply cannot comprehend. She didn't say a word. She didn't ask me where I was taking her, nor did she indicate any destination. She just sat there, in the back seat, motionless, staring out the window as if the world meant nothing to her. As for me, I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but the tension was unbearable. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, and my breathing was faster than it should have been. Every now and then, I couldn't help but glance at her in the rearview mirror, as if I was expecting to see something that would confirm my worst fears. But every time I did, all I saw was her still, pale, unmoving figure. She looked like a statue, a figure straight out of a nightmare. Several minutes passed in that uncomfortable silence. The road began to curve, and I remembered that we were approaching one of the most dangerous bends in the Cruz Verde Pass. Locals always talked about that curve, about the number of accidents that had happened there, about the lives that had been lost. My foot lightly pressed on the brake pedal, and it was at that moment that I heard her.
"Be
"Careful," she whispered. Her voice was soft, so soft that I barely heard it over the car's engine. But what unsettled me the most wasn't the tone, nor even the warning itself. It was the feeling that came over me when I heard her. It was as if those words hadn't been spoken by someone alive, as if they came from some deep, dark place beyond what is human. The car began to skid slightly as I tried to brake before the bend, and I felt the steering wheel resist in my hands. For a second, I thought we were going to go off the road, that we were going to crash. But somehow, I managed to regain control of the vehicle and navigate the bend without any major incident. When I finally straightened the car out, I felt a momentary sense of relief, but that relief vanished as soon as I turned my head toward the back seat. She was gone. The seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. There was no trace that anyone had ever been there. Only the silence, that damn silence that now felt heavier than ever. I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. For a few seconds, I sat there completely paralyzed, staring at the empty seat. The cold still lingered in the air, and the smell of dampness was still present, but she had disappeared. I got out of the car, breathing heavily, and looked around, expecting to see her walking along the roadside again. But there was no one. The road was deserted. The shadows of the trees stretched toward the horizon like ghostly hands trying to catch me. The wind began to blow harder, whispering through the branches, and for a moment, I thought I heard something within those whispers. Something that wasn't the wind. I climbed back into the car, my heart pounding. I tried to process what had just happened, but it was impossible. No logic, no reasoning could explain what I had just witnessed. I started the car again, with trembling hands, and drove as fast as I could, trying to get away from that cursed road. But when I got home, the terror didn't disappear. Despite the safety of the four walls around me, the warm glow of the lights, and the familiar smell of coffee, something still felt wrong, deeply wrong. What I had experienced on the road followed me like a shadow, a presence I couldn't shake off. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, and cold sweat dripped from my forehead. It felt like I hadn't truly escaped the road, as if, somehow, whatever had happened out there had followed me here, into the safety of my home. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, as if that strange feeling of being watched persisted, even now. I headed to the kitchen and filled a glass with water. I drank it in big gulps, trying to calm my nerves, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. I felt the cold I had experienced in the car still clinging to my skin, as if I was still wrapped in the darkness of that cursed road. Everything in my home, which was normally my refuge, my place of peace, seemed strange, as if the shadows in the corners had grown longer, as if the light couldn't quite dispel the darkness completely. I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face, hoping to clear my mind. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I was shocked by the reflection staring back at me. My eyes were wide open, bloodshot from exhaustion and fear. My face was pale, much paler than I remembered, and a small part of me wondered if that's what she had seen in me. Was there something different about my appearance? Something darker? The clock read nearly 1:30 a.m., but the exhaustion didn't seem enough to drown out the adrenaline keeping me on edge. I collapsed onto the living room sofa, turned on the TV for some background noise, and looked at my phone for any distraction. But I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman on the road, how she had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as easily. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories about phantom hitchhikers. We've all heard those tales. The girl at the dangerous bend, the driver who picks her up only to find out later that she's been dead for years. Stories told so often that they lose their power, relegated to the realm of fiction, of the improbable. But I had seen her. I had felt her in my car. And worst of all, her warning that whispered "be careful" wasn't the most terrifying thing. It was the fact that after she disappeared, something had stayed with me. Something I couldn't explain, but that pressed down on my chest with a primal fear. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a product of my exhaustion. Maybe my mind, worn out from work and the treacherous drive, had played tricks on me. Maybe I had imagined everything. But I couldn't ignore the smell that still clung to my clothes. That smell of damp earth and something else, something I couldn't quite identify, and I couldn't ignore what I found in the backseat of my car when I got home. That white handkerchief. I had tried not to look at it during the drive back. I barely dared to adjust the rearview mirror after she disappeared, but I saw it. A simple piece of fabric, stained with mud, folded carefully on the seat where she had been sitting. I was too scared to touch it, so I left it there when I got out of the car. But now, as I sat on the sofa, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How had it gotten there? Was it a sign? A warning? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Her unnaturally pale skin, her dark eyes that seemed bottomless, her voice still echoing in my mind like the distant memory of something I shouldn't have heard. I tried to stay awake, to resist the pull of exhaustion, but eventually it overwhelmed me. I woke up with a jolt. Hours later, my body stiff and my neck aching. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The TV was still on, but the sound was off. I sat up slowly, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Be careful. Be careful." My heart skipped a beat, and terror seized me. I scanned the room, but there was no one. There was no way anyone else could be in the house. But the whisper persisted, as if it came from somewhere beyond the walls, as if it echoed in the very air around me. I got up from the sofa quickly, stumbling over the coffee table as I tried to turn on every light I could. I rushed down the hallway, flipping every switch along the way until the entire house was bathed in light. But the light didn't help. The whisper was still there, reverberating in my ears, in my mind. I went to the window and looked outside into the darkness of the street. The car was still there, parked under the dim glow of a street lamp. The sight of that car made me feel sick. There was something about it, something I couldn't get out of my head, something that forced me to confront what I had seen. I decided to go back to the car. I had to. Maybe if I faced what I had found in the back seat, I could put an end to all of this. I walked down the stairs, and each step felt heavier than the last. I could feel something following me, something I couldn't see, but it was there, breathing down my neck. When I reached the car, the handkerchief was still there, just as I'd left it. But something was different. The back door, which I had carefully closed when I got out, was now slightly ajar. A small sliver of darkness peeked through the gap, as if someone had entered or exited since then. My breathing became erratic. I cautiously reached out and, in one quick motion, opened the door. No one was there. The back seat was empty. Only the handkerchief remained, pristine in appearance, except for the dried mud stains on its surface. I picked it up with trembling hands, and as I held it, the smell of damp earth returned with full force, flooding my senses as if I were standing in the middle of a dark, wet forest. A shiver ran down my spine, and without thinking, I dropped the handkerchief to the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the car as fast as I could, returned to the house, and slammed the door shut. I pressed my back against the wood, trying to regain control, but my thoughts kept circling around one single idea. She was still there. I tried to shake off that feeling, to convince myself that what had happened wasn't real. But I couldn't ignore the fact that something had followed me. Something that had entered my life that night and didn't plan on leaving. And then I heard the sound of the car door closing. The noise echoed with a dull thud in the stillness of the night, making my whole body tense up. It was impossible. I had been the last one out of that car, and I was absolutely sure there was no one else. That sharp slam reverberated in my chest like a dark omen, sinking into my gut and sending my mind into full alert. The house, which only minutes ago had been a safe haven, now felt like a trap, a maze I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, leaning against my front door, my breath coming out in heavy gasps. My throat felt dry and my heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. The air around me seemed to thicken, as if the space itself was closing in on me. Every fiber of my being screamed not to look outside, not to look back at the car, but a stronger force, some morbid instinct, pushed me to do it. With an uncontrollable tremor, I slowly turned toward the window facing the street. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the terror of the unknown consumed me. I stared through the glass, my heart lodged in my throat, a cold sweat running down my back. And there she was. She stood right next to the car, under the pale yellow glow of the streetlight. Her silhouette was unmistakable. The white dress, her long, tangled hair hanging like a thick curtain, and that eerie, unnatural stillness that surrounded her. But this time, something was different. She wasn't motionless like before. This time, her face was turned toward me. She was looking at me. An indescribable fear overtook me. I could feel her gaze from across the distance, even though I couldn't make out her eyes in the dim light. It was as if she were staring right into my soul, ripping away any shred of sanity I had left. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself in my room, to pretend this wasn't happening. but my feet were anchored to the floor, unable to move. And then she started walking.
Hey, John.
Her steps were slow, deliberate,
Don't
but I couldn't
hide.
hear the sound of her footsteps on the asphalt.
Don't be afraid.
It was as if she wasn't really touching the ground. The white dress moved gently, barely stirred by the night breeze, as she advanced toward my house, toward me.
I just want to play.
I could
Play
feel
with me.
every meter she closed between us, like an electric current running through my body, growing closer, more suffocating with each step. I tried to react, tried to move, but it was as though some invisible force kept me frozen in place, watching helplessly as the distance between us shrank. She never broke her gaze, as if she had already decided that I was her next target. Her lips, once closed, parted slightly, and somehow, though I couldn't hear her voice, I felt her calling to me.
Hey, John. Don't hide.
Survival
Don't be
instinct
afraid.
finally
I
kicked
just
in,
wanna
and with a
play.
strangled
Play
cry,
with me.
I pulled away from the window and ran toward the back door of the house. My only thought was to get away, to hide, to find somewhere her gaze couldn't reach me. I felt like a cornered animal, desperate to escape an invisible predator. The walls of the house, once a source of comfort, now felt tight, as if they were conspiring to trap me. When I reached the back door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the handle. The sound of her walking still echoed in my mind, even though I couldn't see her anymore. I knew she was there, getting closer. Finally, I managed to open the door and stepped out into the backyard. The cold night air hit my face, but it brought no relief. The fear was still there, as present as before, like a shadow enveloping me completely. I slammed the door shut behind me and ran to the end of the yard, where an old tool shed stood like a decrepit sanctuary. I slipped inside, locking the rusted latch, and curled up in a dark corner, hugging myself, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breathing was uneven, and every time I exhaled, I felt her presence closer, like the air itself was thick with her essence. Silence took over, but it was a heavy silence. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew she was out there, somewhere, waiting for me.
Hey, John.
My thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to find some logical explanation for everything that was happening, but nothing made sense. This couldn't be real. I couldn't have picked up a dead woman on the side of the road, couldn't have brought her with me. And yet here she was, outside, hunting me.
Play with me.
Minutes passed slowly, each more agonizing than the last. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding furiously against my ribs. I tried not to move, not to make a sound, but my entire body was trembling uncontrollably. Suddenly, I heard a crunch in the grass. My entire body tensed. She was outside in the yard. I could hear her soft movements, her light steps brushing against the earth. My throat tightened with sheer terror, but I forced myself to remain silent, to stay completely still. The dry leaves crunched under her feet, and then the sound stopped. I knew she was right outside the shed. The silence grew even more oppressive. Every second was torture. I could feel her presence on the other side of the door, lurking, waiting. My mind filled with terrifying images. Her pale face, those eyes as black as nothingness, the spectral figure I had seen by the roadside. And now, she was here with me. A few seconds passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Time no longer had any meaning. But just when I thought I might have evaded her, I heard a soft scratch at the door. A sound that chilled my blood. It was as if she was testing, probing, making sure I knew she was out there. My heart was pounding so fast I thought it might give me away. I wanted to scream, but fear kept me silent. Then the scratching turned into a soft, rhythmic knock. 3 knocks, one after another, as if she were knocking, as if she knew I was terrified and wanted to play with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it all to end, for her to leave. But then I heard her voice. It wasn't coming from outside, but from inside my head. A soft, distant whisper, twisting in my mind. Open the door. It was her voice. The same one that had whispered in the car. The same one that had warned me about the curve. Only now it wasn't a warning. It was a command. My hand instinctively moved toward the latch, as if drawn by a force I couldn't control. I fought the impulse, clenching my fist tightly to keep from moving. But the whisper persisted, soft, almost seductive. Let me in. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The terror had taken control of every part of me. But then, as if the night itself took pity on me, everything went silent. The scratching, the voice, the knocking, it all stopped. I no longer heard her footsteps. The air felt lighter, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, she had gone. I didn't move. I didn't want to risk stepping outside and coming face to face with her again. So I stayed there, curled up in the corner of the shed, trembling in fear, until the dawn slowly began to light up the sky. The light filtering through the cracks in the shed was faint at first, a grayish glow that barely scratched the darkness surrounding me. Slowly, the light grew stronger, and with it came a small spark of hope. Maybe with the arrival of day, she would fade, return to wherever she came from, and this nightmare would finally end. I forced myself to breathe deeply, to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The silence continued to wrap the yard like a dense blanket, but I no longer felt her presence as intensely as before. Still, the fear lingered, clinging to every fiber of my being. Outside, the birds began to sing, as if life itself was trying to resume, oblivious to what had happened during the night. Was it safe to go out? I wasn't sure about anything, but I had to. I had to know if she was still there. With trembling hands, I carefully slid the rusty latch on the shed, moving it as quietly as possible, as if the slightest noise could draw her back to me. I cracked the door open just a few inches and peeked out. The morning light filled the yard, bathing everything in an orange glow that, somehow, felt even more sinister after all that had happened. The car was still there, just as I had left it. The leaves on the ground were still, and the cold morning air was crisp, free from the oppressive presence I had felt before. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, something was wrong. The handkerchief, that damned handkerchief I had dropped on the back seat of the car. It wasn't there anymore. Terror struck me again, like an electric current shooting up my spine. Where was it? Had she taken it? Or was this just another hallucination from my exhausted mind? I didn't know what to think, but something inside me screamed that I shouldn't stay in the yard any longer. I felt a visceral urge to go back inside the house, to get away from the car, from the road, from everything that reminded me of that night. I carefully shut the shed door and began to walk slowly toward the entrance of my house. Each step felt eternal, as if something or someone was watching me from some unseen corner. The morning cold had settled deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that even though I couldn't see her, she was still nearby. When I crossed the threshold and closed the door behind me, relief came almost instantly. But it was incomplete. The daylight streaming through the windows gave me a false sense of security. The fear was still there, lurking. Something inside me knew this wasn't over. I headed to the kitchen, my legs still trembling, and made myself a cup of coffee. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the cup. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, a horrible nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the long drive. But every time I thought that, the memory of her pale face, those empty eyes, seized me again. It was too real to have been just an illusion. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. The sound startled me so much that I almost dropped the coffee cup. With my heart still pounding in my temples, I answered, hoping to hear a voice that could comfort me, pull me from this state of paranoia. Hello? My voice sounded weaker than I expected. On the other end of the line, silence. Not absolute silence, but one filled with faint, distant sounds, as if someone was breathing or about to speak, but didn't. Panic started to creep up my chest again. I swallowed hard and with a lump in my throat spoke again. Boo, who is it? And then I heard it. That whisper. As soft as the first time, delicate as a cold wind brushing against my skin. Let me in.
Let me in.
I dropped the phone abruptly and it hit the floor with a dull thud. The whisper had been so clear, so unmistakable. It was her. She had followed me. The house was no longer a refuge. There was nowhere I could hide. She was everywhere. The air around me began to feel heavier, as if the very atmosphere were collapsing. The daylight, which had once comforted me, seemed to fade, and the shadows that had been soft before now stretched and twisted, as if something dark were seeping into my world. Suddenly, I heard a sharp knock at the front door. 3 knocks, exactly like those I had heard in the shed. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. It couldn't be real. I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, staring at the door as if it were the mouth of a tunnel opening into the abyss. Then the knock sounded again, this time louder. 3 knocks, one after another, resonating throughout the house. My mind screamed at me, pleading not to approach, not to answer, but my feet, driven by some irrational impulse, began to move toward the door. When I reached it, I paused in front of it. My hand trembled as it rose, slowly extending toward the doorknob. Silence became absolute, as if the world were holding its breath. And then, the doorknob began to turn on its own. I recoiled immediately, my entire body tensing, feeling an indescribable cold fill the air. The door creaked open slowly, with a sound that seemed to come from another time, another place. I didn't want to look. Didn't want to know what was on the other side. but I couldn't help it. And when my eyes finally landed on the entrance, there was no one there. The threshold was empty. The street, bathed in daylight, was calm and tranquil. But that emptiness didn't bring relief. Instead, it brought a much greater sense of void, an abyss I couldn't see but that enveloped me. I tried to step back, to close the door again, but before I could move, I felt a cold breath on my neck, and a voice, soft, close, too close. I'm already inside. The terror I felt at that moment is beyond description. It was something that transcended fear, beyond any human emotion. It was the certainty that she had been with me all along, that she had never left, and that now she was inside me, occupying the same space as my soul. I screamed, a desperate, primal scream, but the sound died on my lips. The cold enveloped me completely, and the darkness, that relentless darkness, closed in on me, devouring me from within. In that moment, I knew there was no escape. She was not just a ghost from the road. She was something much worse. Something that had latched onto me, something I couldn't shake off, something that wouldn't stop until it took me with her. And so, as the last light of day faded away, I realized that my life, as I knew it, had come to an end. The road hadn't been the finale. It was just the beginning.
Be cheerful.